Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. So my name is Anna Yang. I will be your host and the chair of the discussion today. So welcome and thank you for joining today's session, Redesigning Environment, the third in our event series that will look at how radical design thinking can solve some of today's most pressing challenges. So just to be a bit of housekeeping rules, the event today is not held under Chatham House rule, and it will be recorded, and so you'll be able to see the video recordings afterwards. Please post any questions you have for our panelists in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring it, and we'll try to answer some of your questions during the Q&A in the second half of this event. So today, we'll be hearing from a fantastic lineup of speakers, and they include Oksana Bondar, she's Director of Design at Biome, Daniel Raven Ellison, founder of the National Park City Initiative, and Professor Peter Rees, who's a professor of places and city planning at UCL, the Bartlett School of Planning. But before we hear from them, I would like to give you an overview of why we're talking about this today. Well, today in the UK, we complete 1 year since the UK government announcement of the lockdown. And the COVID crisis has unveiled some of the deep failures of our current system. Our health system, our environment system, the way we live, the way we move around, how much energy we use. And it made us think and reflect about how our living environment, work environment, the health system, and some of the structural issues that affect our society today. It also made us realize how these are no longer fit for purpose for the future that we want to live in. So Chatham House and London Design Biennale team joined up and created a unique initiative to bring together policy and design community. And the idea was that together we can think about how can we help build healthier, greener, more equal and prosperous society. So Design in a Time of Crisis is a global open call that was issued in July 2020. We invited radical design ideas and solutions from the world's design community, the public, and the young people. And it had the objective to activate people's agency and harness the creativity of radical thinking and new solutions to 4 themes: health, environment, society, and work. So following the open call, we received over 500 submissions from over 50 countries from across the world. In January this year, we launched almost all of those submissions onto an online gallery at the London Design Biennale website for the public view. A selection of these submissions will be showcased in June 2021 as part of the London Design Biennale exhibition taking place at the Somerset House. So today's conversation is a continuation to this call to action. So we have been hosting a series of discussions, and basically these conversations is to activate your agency and tap into your creativity. So once a month, we will be tackling each of the 4 themes. We started last month with health, and this month is environment. So why environment? I mean, environment because of all the climate crisis that we're living, the biodiversity loss, all the over-resource use. So we're trying to tap into radical design thinking that can play a major role in building a more environmentally sustainable world through our landscape and localities. So design can help us address some of the most challenging environmental issues, and innovation can also improve spaces, innovation thinking, especially in cities, through the use of materials, techniques, and find some of out-of-the-box ways through which we can connect with our cities and with our neighborhoods. We had tons of submissions addressing environment issues coming from many angles. And, you're seeing a couple of them here, and they are from the pop-up ecosystem, LOT from Royal College of Art, Urban Hives, and Kaikao. So, but go to the website and check out the submissions for yourself. So I'm going to now hand over to our wonderful panel of speakers that are going to discuss how design policy community can collaborate together to deliver a better future that works for all of us. So shall we start with Peter, please? Professor Peter.
Well, hello, everyone, and whoever, whatever, and wherever you are, I'm happy to join you today because we're all placemakers. I'm always having to tell my students that it's not architects or planners that make places, it's people. It's our job as architects and planners to help them to do that. Now, I've spent my professional career as a placemaker, working on inner urban areas, finally in the City of London. And I've always enjoyed trying to achieve a balance between competing needs. And that is one thing that planners do have to do. Everybody wants something different. And I've always said that the test of a good planner is universal unpopularity. Because if anybody's really happy with us, it probably means that we've got the balance wrong and they're getting more than everybody else. So often difficult to drum this into students, but I do notice that increasingly the younger generation are more aware of the role of society, more aware of their place within it, and more keen to work with people to achieve solutions rather than to try to impose them. So I think we're making progress. Now, today is a very good time to be reviewing our skills or lack of skills as placemakers, because it's 1 year into the age of pandemics. And you notice I use the plural, not the singular. We have moved into a different age. We have moved into an age where mass travel is now imperiling our survival. Wherever the COVID pandemic started and however it started, there's no doubt how it was spread. It's spread by tourists. People went to the Alps last winter, came home and killed their grandparents. In the summer, they couldn't wait to get to the beaches of Southern Europe. And lo and behold, we had another spike in infections when they returned. It's interesting that in Germany and Italy at the moment, in the areas where they're closest to the skiing resorts, even though they're closed, we're getting a spike in the pandemic again. We already knew that tourism was bad for the planet, environmentally, in terms of the pollution that it causes and the carbon load of all that cheap travel, especially air travel. But we've also seen how cruise liners and the contents of them are actually destroying places like Venice, where socially and culturally, there is nothing left worth seeing because of the way it's been wrecked by people who are there purely to consume it and to make no contribution in return. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity, this pandemic, this being locked in, to review how much we need to travel. If we made better places, we might be inclined to spend more time in them, rather than neglecting them as we do, and then disappearing as far as possible away from them as soon as we have some free time. So what I'd like to do is to see communities with engaged professionals actually improving their own neighborhoods. To me, the perfect place is an allotment. A patch of ground that is parceled out into small units that people can rent to grow food. Those people work together, they share ideas, they share seeds, they share equipment. Hardly anything is ever thrown away, it's always recycled and reused. It connects old people with knowledge, with younger people with keenness and stronger muscles. And that, to me, is the perfect sort of place. It's socially bonding, it's sustainable, and it is actually creating somewhere that people like to be. When they have spare time, they go to their allotment for the social, the physical, and the environmental benefit that it brings them. So I'd like to see more allotments, not just for growing things, but for growing ideas. I'd like to see multi-story car parks and the roofs of buildings rented out, allocated to people that have good ideas. We could call them local allotments rather than allotments. And these local allotments could be the start of our new communities. Now, I know people say, oh, well, you know, we need a policy for this. And I say, no, the last thing we need is a policy. I don't think I've achieved anything in my life as the result of a policy. In my early 20s, I was posed with a problem when I was a civil servant about the impact of those bright, wide, yellow no parking lines in historic areas. And I managed to get the signs manual for the country changed to allow them to be half the width and a paler yellow. And they said to me, oh, for the policy, we'll need to know the color, the BS color number, the definition of the color of yellow. I said, that's simple. It's 1 bucket of white to 1 bucket of yellow. It's half the pigment. So we now have yellow lines that have 1/4 of the pigment, half the width and half the pigment. I didn't go near a politician in doing that. Not one politician was involved. It was just an enthusiastic young civil servant setting his mind at making contacts, probably down the pub, and getting people to get things changed. So we can all do little things like that. We're all in some position to make a difference in our local surroundings. So let's think local. What do they say? Local spaces for local people. Instead of building grand spaces to attract yet more tourists and ruin them, like we've done on the South Bank in London, which used to be a nice place to go, used to be a cultural place to go. Now it's just full of people with excess consumption of food and alcohol. And it isn't a nice place to go and to enjoy the wonderful views of London. So let's think more about working with the local communities in order to shape our places for the future. This is an ideal time to do it. So remember, places shape our lives. It's our duty to help to shape the places ourselves. Let's make better places and spend more time in them. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for that. I love the idea of local allotment. Probably need to talk more about that. Oksana.
Hello, my name is Oksana Bonda, and I'm the Director of Design at Biome. Biome is a research and development-led biomanufacturing company. And when it comes to reshaping and redesigning processes, products, and systems, we believe there is no better place to look for inspiration, as well as to learn from than the natural world. Nature has faced and resolved all challenges through billions of years of evolution and holds answers to engineering, design, economic, and systemic problems. And this nature-inspired approach to design is commonly known as biomimetics. And biomimetic design is the way of abstract informations, structures, functions, and processes in biological systems in order to synthesize man-made products and systems that solve a problem. So these principles of biomimetics are at the very core and the heart of everything that we do at Biome, and are embodied in our collection of bio-based materials, circular construction systems and products, our biomanufacturing facilities, as well as in the way that we do business. So at Biome, we believe that biomimetic thinking can allow us to take the idea of redesigning for the environment further and equip us with all the necessary tools to design with the environment instead. So for example, we collaborate directly with nature and harness the power of mycelium, which is the vegetative root structure of mushrooms, to produce mycelium insulation panels and a number of other products. As many of you may know, that in nature, the concept of waste is non-existent, and all that perishes becomes food for the new life. And we follow that rule very closely and work with various fungi species to build upon the organism's ability to create complex binding networks when growing through organic and synthetic byproducts. Our mycelium products are intentionally designed also to have a positive impact on health and well-being. Our mycelium insulation panel, for instance, has scored A+ when tested for VOCs, or the indoor air quality, which allows it to contribute to the healthy fabric of our buildings. We're also in the process of developing a collection of mycelium products, such as lighting and acoustic panels. And these products, we hope, will contribute even further to creating healthy indoor spaces through the natural materials qualities, as well as the biomimetic design principles, which evolve around natural pattern and form finding, which allows us to bring the beauty and functionality of those great and gorgeous outdoors in, contributing further to the positive impact on our psychological, physiological, and emotional well-being, and in a hope to rebuild the long-lost connection to nature. Our facilities are also designed in accordance with biomimetic principles, but they expand on the concept of symbiosis and cooperation. So for example, our first biomanufacturing facility in West Somerset is designed to be community-led and has been established in partnership with the local social enterprise Onion Collective. All of us are looking very glamorous, rock star-like here on this picture, and that was before the build started. So this facility will be delivering 3,000 square meters of insulation per month towards the end of this year, utilizing at least 30 tons of waste and sequestering up to 6 tons of carbon per month. So the facility in itself is going to be a carbon sink, as well as it will be the catalyst for social regeneration, instilling the concept of community agency through a 50% profit share business model. And our R&D headquarters in South Bermondsey, which I'm at now, which is really exciting, is another example of a symbiotic and hyperlocal operations that we're working on, where we work very closely with neighboring businesses, a council, and a public to divert waste streams into the facility and return valuable products back into the local ecosystem. And this way, we are playing kind of the role of a digesting and replenishing organism in a dense ecosystem of such dense urban system places like London. So in conclusion, I just would like to say that by taking time to truly appreciate and understand nature's genius and allowing it to guide us through the challenges we face when creating the built environment, we can not only solve the problems that we have self-inflicted upon ourselves, but to start having a regenerative impact on the natural world, becoming an integral part of the nature's multi-species equilibrium at long last through designing with the environment.
Thank you. Thank you, Oksana. And last but not least, Daniel.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. So my name is Dan Revenellis, and I'm a guerrilla geographer. Guerrilla geography is radical, surprising, creative geographies. And in my guerrilla geography practice, for me, it's very much about challenging myself and others to think differently about the world and make sort of new connections in their brains. I'm currently working on a project called Slowways, which is all about creating a network of footpaths that connect all the towns and cities in the UK so people can more easily see and imagine how they can make journeys by foot. But 7 years ago, I started another project, which I'd like to talk to you about. It's all about sort of this idea of national park cities, and actually London became the world's first national park city in 2019. Now, for many of you who haven't heard of this idea, it might seem like an extraordinary idea, maybe a ridiculous idea, maybe even the antithesis to what you think a city may be about. But I'm going to try and explain the concept and how I think it fits with design specifically. So I'm very fortunate to have visited lots of national parks, walked across all the national parks in the UK wearing a mind-reading device. And when you explore national parks a lot, you begin to notice something, which is that across the family of protected areas around the world, there are protected areas that reflect every single internationally recognized major habitat and landscape that you can imagine, from deserts and glaciers to mountains and rainforests. Every single one is in that international family, apart from one, which is the world's fastest growing habitat, which is urban areas. Now, that for me doesn't make sense on a number of levels. Purely from a nature conservation perspective, it doesn't make sense for a number of reasons. Firstly, for me, I don't think that urban life is worth less than rural life. The peregrine falcons that inhabit London are just as valuable, just as awesome as those in the Peak District or Yosemite National Parks. And actually, with all the urban canyons and all the parakeets, there are more peregrine falcons in London than there are in those two other national parks. People need great habitats. We know that orangutans need clean air, clean water, need trees. Well, go figure. We're animals, we need those things too. Also, really importantly, cities are places of extraordinary power. So from a nature conservation perspective, we've been brought up in many wildlife documentaries thinking that nature conservation is predominantly done by an expert person, probably a scientist in a distant land with some charismatic megafauna. But the reality is the place where most of us have power to create the most change is where we live in cities, through our voting power, through our consumption power, but also, like on the allotments and other places, through the things that we can do under our feet, on our balconies, on our rooftops, in our gardens, through our everyday decisions and lives. Crucially as well, fourth really important reason is that cities are phenomenally enjoyable too. So I love going for a walk in the rainforest or in a desert or through the moorlands of the Cairngorms. But actually, London with its 300 languages, its incredible cultural diversity, its architecture, its diversity of species and habitats and places, London is accessible and enjoyable to hike and enjoy as well. Finally, actually in the future, if we want to tackle the ecological crisis, I would argue the health crisis, the climate crisis, we need cities to be desirable and functional and healthy, which means we need fantastic public and open spaces. And as cities become denser in some places, that we protect those spaces as well. So for all those reasons, it kind of didn't make sense to me why it would be that you would exclude urban areas from national parks. But what I became to realize over the campaign and collaborating with thousands of people on the London National Park City campaign is that it's not really an issue of representation, which is what I'm interested in to some degree as a geographer. It's actually that national park thinking is missing from our cities. So what makes the national park city idea different maybe to other initiatives that are out there are just a few things which I'll just touch on briefly in my remaining sort of couple of minutes. Firstly, national parks are about landscape scale thinking. It's about the whole of a landscape, which means that everyone, everything, everywhere, doing good things or bad things, contributing or not, aware or not, are contributing towards that landscape, right? And that means that actually, in terms of the London National Park City, the administrative boundaries of the GLA are very arbitrary, because if you're a swallow or a swift, if you're rain, water, or a commuter, you don't recognize those boundaries. So why would we? But crucially, it's super inclusive because of that landscape perspective. It makes it very holistic. Secondly, really importantly, from a design perspective, it's about framing, right? It's about reframing the purpose of the city. So the city isn't just a financial and cultural center and political center like we think of it as. Actually, it's an ecological center too. And guess what? For hundreds, if not thousands of years, a couple of thousand years, people in London have been protecting, enclosing, celebrating, enjoying green spaces in various different ways. We could just be much better at it than we are at the moment. So the thing about the national park and the city idea is that we know roughly what a city is for, right? It's for watching Netflix and for going to work and for trying not to be stressed out and having, all those sort of things. It's predominantly for the city, right? But the purpose of a national park, okay, through our common understanding and language of that in the Western European context anyway, is it's a better place, a place where we have a better relationship with nature, we have a better relationship with culture, and we probably have a better relationship with ourselves as well. So by augmenting and reframing the city as a national park, of which we have a common understanding of what the purpose of that is for, it is almost like the ultimate placemaking exercise in saying that everything that then happens within the national park city landscape, that environment, is for that purpose. Crucially as well, it's forever. So what I just finished on very quickly is that we're all familiar with those Yogi Bear national parks in the States, where the federal government has all the power and they can shoot you. We're familiar with the national parks we have in the UK that are delivered through partnership because so many people own and occupy the land. And then we're also familiar maybe with those national parks that are led by indigenous and local people who have lived on the land for thousands of years and are best placed to look after it. A national park city then in London with national, local, regional government, with the businesses and charities and organizations across the city, with the 9 million people, 15,000 species, 9 million trees that are in the city, is about a combination of all three of those things. Top-down policy, partnership working, but definitely grassroots action too.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everyone. So we have about 30 minutes for a conversation and for Q&A. So before, I had a question up my sleeve before opening up to the Q&A for audience. So my first question, because I think the whole purpose of the design in time of crisis is bringing two communities together, the creative, I'm going to say the creative people, but like the creative industry, and then also some of the policymakers. And then to see through these conversations and through these different sort of dialogues, whether different kind of new insights come out of it. And so I would like to hear from you, your perspective, how can policy help design? And also how can design help policy? You can, whoever wants to take this question.
I'll jump in first, as I'm the only one not on mute at the moment. Firstly, I think design, crucially, can lead to better decision making by policymakers and by government as well. Actually, I think for me, Peter, you talk about policy. I think that my family has policies as well. So when I think of policy, I think of it right through the spectrum, you know. But so I think that it can lead to better decision making and so better outcomes, whatever better means in the context of the government at the time. But then I think that there's a slight problem the other way around, that I don't think government is doing enough in terms of creating opportunities for good design to flourish. So across this city and many other cities, actually we've seen sometimes for a very long time what the solutions are, but for some reason those solutions aren't being catalyzed or spread up or scaled up as equitably or as quickly as they should do. And the number of, you know, design events I've been to years ago where the ideas just haven't sort of caught on, or been to different parts of London and those ideas haven't spread, I think it's just absolutely phenomenal. So I think there's an issue of stagnation in policy to enable ideas to flourish more effectively.
Thank you, Dan. Peter, would you like to come in on that?
Yes, traditionally in this country, we have a planning system which is the reverse of the rest of the world. The rest of the world cannot do anything until there is a policy or a plan to enable it to be done. You're told what you can do. In this country, the policies are to tell you what you can't do. And this is all to do with the fact that we have the old-fashioned common law system, which is based on precedent. So our planning system has to follow that. So you have a right to do anything unless there's a policy or a rule which tells you you can't. I think that's not a bad way around, because by and large in my career, I've found that policies were things that politicians drew up in order to claim the credit for things that had already happened. And most good ideas come in spite of policies. Most good designs come in spite of policies. But I think it is right to have policies to limit how far people can go in what we might collectively think of as wrong directions. I mean, if we didn't have London City Airport, there wouldn't be a limit on how high you could build in London. So I'm always grateful for London City Airport, because it means you can't build taller than 300 meters in the City of London or at Canary Wharf. And that's, you know, a wonderful non-policy that achieves what should be in a policy objective. So rather than having policies, for instance, the mayor has policies for growth zones around London. Now, we all know what that means. Yet another thicket of skyscrapers of no use, residential buildings for investment, buildings that are largely empty. We see them at Vauxhall, we see them in City Road, just outside the city. All over London, we have these weeds coming up, and they're all directly the result of a political policy for growth, which is only seen as the most profitable development of the land as high as you can possibly go. Now, I would prefer to see a policy for London's skyline, a policy to restrict the growth of London. And, you know, this wonderful idea of the national park city, the green belt isn't big enough. It needs to be grown inwards. We don't need to be encroaching into it. We need to be connecting up and growing fingers into the city to revitalize London. Growth is a politician's excuse for kicking problems down the road to the next generation to solve them. I think what we need is policies for equilibrium and for constraint, rather than policies for growth.
Thank you, Peter. Roxana, do you want to come in on how policy can help design, or the other way around?
Yeah, absolutely. I would second Dan and Peter on many points that they have mentioned. From design to policymaking, I think, you know, we're facing enormous challenges of climate crisis, of the challenge of biodiversity, social injustice. So in order for design to respond to that, it needs to be very radical in its nature, agile, and the response and the action needs to happen really fast as well. So this demands for a very dynamic response and the right environment from policy world. So I think that's what would be great to see, you know, because there is, like mentioned before, there are solutions out there, you know. There are so many people working on it. There's so much passion. It's visible in the industry. It's visible in the society. So it's I guess, it's that equilibrium and symbiosis of all the different parties that need to be involved to make the change happen. So, policy coming together with design and many other stakeholders. And I think from design, I always describe design as a problem-solving tool, so, and like mentioned before, again, it's a way of making better decisions, creative decisions, potentially looking outside the box and encompassing many other disciplines as well. That's to me what design could bring and contribute to policy making and decision making.
Thank you, Oksana. So we have now, I'm going to just skim through some of the Q&A questions that here. There was one here, which is also a broader question, which is how can people learn more about the ideas of how to connect natural world in our growing cities? How to bring, or was it Peter saying, how does forest or the green space grow into cities? How can we enable people to learn more about that and then let them sort of take action on it?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think I just beat Peter to it then. I think there's a real issue with there being a gap in people's imagination and experience. And I raise this point that across London, we do have many of the examples of best practices and solutions that I think would make, a fantastic future city. And I think just a very simple thing of taking people by the hand to show them neighborhoods where things are actually happening so they can see it happen. So they can then go, oh, okay, well, actually, I can see how you do that now, because people are quite often intelligent enough and smart enough to work things out for themselves. So that's part of it. But going back to the point that Peter again was raising on a permissive society, I think there's maybe 1 in 1,000 people in England who would be willing to be a guerrilla gardener and be naughty and risk being sort of told off. But maybe 1 in 10, if they were given permission, would actually do it. And there seems to almost be this opportunity for like a Tinder style app or some sort of a solution like that basically marries up land with permission, with resources, with person to say, now you can get on with it. Or for that matter, because of the Englishness of the city, to put more invitations into the city to invite certain types of behavior as well, right? So that might be about growing and planting. But for example, I really like play street signs. So in terms of children getting out and being playful and redesigning streets themselves, there's nothing actually in the street to indicate that there's a priority or opportunity for that for children over parked cars, for example. And so I think there's an opportunity, again, in terms of framing, for politicians to reframe the purpose of a street so that those people who want to sort of say that children shouldn't be playing out or it's dangerous can be told by those children, where to get off.
I agree with that. And I'd add perhaps that the one thing we could do to improve the connection of people to their neighborhoods in urban areas is to provide them with security of tenure. At the moment, people's residential accommodation is often at the mercy of other people who see it simply as a way to make money. They see it as a pension fund for themselves, the buy-to-let move. And more people have less and less security of tenure in our cities. And as a result, connect less and less with their surroundings. They don't see the point of the guerrilla gardening or taking an allotment or improving a local space if they don't know whether they're going to be there in a few months. So I'd like to see something that could be done at government level. Rather than having more design guides or policies for design, I'd like to see them taking a few nettles by the hand and pulling them up. And one of them is to provide security of tenure for rented property, something equivalent to what you have in the great cities of Germany, France, Austria, where if you keep paying your rent and you don't trash the place, then you're there for life if you want to be. But the other thing is we've got to discourage amateurs from getting involved in property as an asset. We've got to encourage them to see it as a utility, something they use, rather than something they simply use to make money out of. And I think if we could tackle those issues, accept that urban areas are not the places to try to achieve universal home ownership. It's a nonsense. All universal home ownership policies ever achieved was the banking crash. So what we want is professionally managed, high quality rented property and security of tenure. And I think spaces will improve as a result.
Thank you, Peter. There's a question here on the design side, so I'm going to direct it to Oksana. So here it says, design is a way of telling stories. If we're trying to live in harmony with nature, what stories should design and designers be telling us?
Good question. I guess from my point of view, the story that I personally would like to tell through design is the story. There are a lot of them actually, but again, it's, I guess, one of the ones that springs to mind is the story of complexity and order, for instance, something that is all over the natural world, is beautiful, and it's something that is not just aesthetically beautiful, but also is philosophically right, and something that would speak, I think, to a lot of people. You know, the story of you know, the multi-species and so many different organisms and structures and forms and colors and whatnot, and how is that all incredibly in the same time in order? So that's one of the stories, I guess. I could go on, but I guess maybe that's a good little example.
Yeah, that's a very good example. I don't know if Dan or Peter have ideas on what are different ways of telling stories that can inspire.
Just as a comment on the power of stories, I think is the potential for people to be taught and to learn that that you can create stories by doing things, and by doing things, those create stories that can then influence others. So in other words, we don't just have to be storytellers or historians, right? We can intentionally do things which we can then tell stories about to influence others. And that's very different from sort of being in a passive situation of just describing the situation you're in. I think if young people were taught to have that kind of agency, then when they're thinking about what they're designing and what they're doing in that context, they'll be thinking about how they influence on others.
Yeah.
Yes, storytelling is so important. I mean, I would say that as a Welshman and a Celt. Our culture got on very well before we discovered how to write things down, because we passed on our knowledge orally. Traveling bards would go around telling stories, and people learned about their history, they learned about philosophy from those storytellers. It worries me sometimes to see the way storytelling is being sidelined as a result of social media. Even when you're on the phone with somebody, you tend to tell stories. When you're sitting on a bus next to somebody or eavesdropping on somebody else, you hear stories being told. But when it's texts, when it's Facebook, when it's the bits and pieces online, this constant babble, there's not much space for stories. So I'm a great believer in that. When I gave up my professional career and went into teaching, I thought I'd better do some training because the students rather sitting in a lecture theatre have got lots of distractions in the form of their mobile phones and their laptops. So I went off and did a course in stand-up comedy. And when you think about it, stand-up comedians are some of the best storytellers of all. I think if you can withhold the vital piece of information until the very last word of the sentence, then there's a chance people will actually listen to your story.
That's a really good, that's something that maybe we should all, well, two things. One is, I agree with you, Dan, that the story we tell is the story that we start to imagine about the future, and then you start to live it and you start to activate that. And also, Peter, your idea about doing a course on stand-up comedian, maybe I should do that as well. We've been sharing discussions at Chatham House, so that's more likely. I have a question here, which is quite a big question that may take us quite a while, because big question as in many folds to it. So could the current COVID-19 pandemic provide the ideal opportunity to radically reconsider what is really important in urban planning? Is it access to green space, rewilding, and others? So what can we learn from this time? Peter, I think everybody's waiting for you. Then I'll hand over to Dan and Oksana.
Oh dear, yes, the big one. Well, I did sort of touch on it earlier, and yes, I do think this is an ideal opportunity for rethinking. But I think that we must be a bit careful not to be conned by the media into believing that the COVID-19 pandemic is going to change everything. I don't believe it will on its own. I was trying to think the other day of what changes there had been in urban areas as a result of the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. Now that killed, well, I don't know, 10, 20 times more people than COVID is likely to kill. But I can think of nothing that changed in the way we live as a result of that pandemic. However, one thing that the pandemic can do, and I think this pandemic is doing, is to accelerate changes that were already happening. Now, back in the early 20s, the early part of this century, we had a banking crash, as you may remember. A lot of young people were made redundant in the financial institutions in the City of London, and they weren't ready to retire. They couldn't afford to. So they moved out and they started up new businesses, new ideas, new financial and tech firms. And rather than moving far away, they stayed as close as possible. They went to Shoreditch. And Shoreditch became a place of startups in the new tech industries. They developed new ways of working. You might have found them sunbathing on the roof of the building or playing five-a-side football in the street or in the coffee bar. They were actually working. They were group working. And they developed this idea of merging leisure and work. Now, that is a change which is not going to stop. It's been interesting as some of the bigger financial institutions have reduced their staff in the city. The small startup businesses have been moving back into the city from Shoreditch, pushed out by the speculation on property and by the investment resi developments that are going on there. So they've been repopulating the city with WeWork and other kinds of startup organizations. But they still expect to combine work and leisure. They expect to come into work in the morning and then maybe go off to the gym halfway through the morning, rather than have to go to the gym at 6 o'clock on their way to work. So those sort of trends, this greater flexibility, we're going to have just as many people wanting to come together to meet and exchange ideas. Places like the City of London are not going to evaporate. People are not going to want to carry on working from home. And as so many of my students say, what do you mean working at home? We haven't got homes, we're sharing. We're sofa surfing. We want to get back to university. We want to get back to the office. So we will see a return, but on a much more flexible basis. Everything is going to be much more fluid, and I think that's very exciting. I'm really looking forward to seeing the way things change, and they will, but not purely as a result of the pandemic. That's simply an accelerant.
Thank you, Peter. Dan, Oksana?
You go, Dan.
Thank you. Okay. You know, it's interesting. I just think about my own lived experience during this crisis and different sort of key things. And I found it very interesting being involved with the London National Park City, watching the news during the first sort of lockdown and the restrictions around that, and how there seems to be two stories playing out, actually. One story, which was essentially about whether or not our critical illness infrastructure could cope, so our NHS. And at the same time, there'd been a lack of language really around articulating that our public parks are critical wellness infrastructure, which, by the way, aren't as well protected or as funded as they could be. And I got reflecting on that and thinking about how the shape of use of the parkland around where I live in Ealing and West London sort of shifted, and how actually I discovered this incredibly large and beautiful private park, right, that I had no idea it was there because of the way that it was positioned in the landscape. And actually, if you do a bit of research into London's parkland, what you begin to realize is that roughly about a third of parkland in London is private parkland. Now, I don't mean those small green squares in central West London, which people feel alienated by because they're shared by lots of wealthy people, which I feel more sympathetic to, because the equivalent would be knocking down. I live in a terraced house, in a rented terrace house. The equivalent for me would be knocking down all the fences in our back garden and sharing that space, which I think actually would be a lovely thing. And then people could then complain that the fences should come down so everyone can have access, would be that argument. But that third of private land I'm talking about, incredible swathes of the capital that people cannot access, that they can see. So close to where I am in Ealing, there's some tall, very deprived areas of housing that overlook this sort of private parkland, which have some of the lowest levels of access to green space and nature in the capital, yet they can't access it. But temporarily, briefly, during the lockdowns, everyone could access out into these spaces, and they became multifunctional and far more inclusive. And these private parks I'm talking about are called golf courses. And I'm sure that there's some places in the world where golf might be appropriate. And for me, it's almost a magical sport, because it's almost like playing snooker over like a landscape, which is just incredible that people can even do that. So I'm not going to get away with the fact that it's not like an amazing sport. But it has no place to be in swathes of London. A third of our parkland, effectively, right, should not be these spaces of exclusion. And I think the failure for us to think about how we can reclaim those spaces to be super multifunctional for all the things they could be used for, from sports to recreation, for the diversity of people who could be using those spaces, I think is, in line with maybe the idea that things won't change too much unless we remember it and seize it.
And great sand pits already built.
Well, I don't want to get on the sand pits. They're just, not so safe for toddlers at the moment.
Oksana?
Yeah, Dan, you kind of expressed what I was going to say. I think because of the pandemic, we all have we've slowed down, we've stopped even for a little bit, and I think a lot of us will come back after the pandemic with a different attitude to what spaces are and to what social life is. So I think I personally believe that what it will do is it would allow us to radically reconsider how we use the spaces and what we use them for. So that multifunctionality, we all crave to be with one another. We also, because of the calmness that we've had and the isolation, I think I hope we've developed a much more gentle attitude towards the natural world as well. So I think what we will see happen is much more considerate use of those spaces, and try to reconnect again with one another, as well as our cities that we have been all alone in.
Alone, but together, but alone, or something like
Together
that.
but alone, yeah.
So we are now we have 10 more minutes until the end. I have one question for each one of you, I think, and then I have one final question for all of you. So one question to Oksana here is, what do you think is the best way to disrupt the existing construction industry with new technologies and materials to encourage greener, more sustainable development? A question to Peter, which is, we're very likely to see a lot of vacant offices. So that links to the whole multifunctionality. What ideas would you have to how to repurpose these cities, and then also how to revive the local high street? And to Dan, on your thoughts about the garden bridge that never happened. Was this a lesson, and what kind of obstacle we face ahead of us? One for each one of you. So Oksana, for you, is what kind of new disruptive, what do you think is the best way to disrupt existing construction industry with new technologies and materials?
Well, I believe that's exactly what we're doing at Biome. So I think it's not one, I think it's a systemic approach and thinking. So it's not just using bio-based materials, for instance. I think it's using bio-based materials, using waste streams to make the bio-based materials. It's also the way we make those bio-based materials, for instance, the way we design with them. I think the way we have designed so far our buildings, our products, might not be the way forward as well. So why don't we rethink the square, rectangular, box-shaped buildings and really pioneer a new way of intelligent building and constructing our cities. And I guess it's also the lifetime of what we make is also very important and needs to be disrupted as well. So we build, well, our buildings are built to last 4 centuries. However, do we use them for centuries? We don't. So it's that as well, and what happens to all those materials after we've knocked down all the buildings we've built 15 years before. So yeah, hopefully I've answered my questions. I think it's a systemic approach to disruption of the industry. And I think it's disruption is a bit of an aggressive term as well. I think it's collaborative approach to this as well, you know, so it's not about working against each other, it's trying to work together. No more in isolation, please. I think, yes, it's working together and thinking systemically and considering all the stakeholders, including innovation, society, environment, everything that is at stake.
Thank you. Peter?
Yes, I don't foresee a major problem with unused offices. We've been losing office space very rapidly in London for the past couple of decades. Throughout the West End, they've been being converted in places like Mayfair. I think over 1 million square feet of offices have been lost every year in Westminster for quite a few years now. Around the edges of London, offices have been converted. Places like Croydon and Richmond have lost almost all their offices as a result of a government policy to allow conversion to residential use without planning permission, which meant that a lot of offices that were in use had the tenants thrown out. And the housing that's been produced has been of very low quality. So I think in terms of our high-rise buildings, it's much more how are we going to repurpose the underused residential that we have built. The piles of safety deposit boxes that have been built along the banks of the Thames, where hardly anybody lives. You know, you only have to go up the river at 5 o'clock on a winter evening to see how few lights there are on in those buildings. But the question also asked about the high street. Now, I think that is something that we do need to take in hand. We do need to start to address this. Changes in retail have again been accelerated by the pandemic, not caused by, but accelerated. We are buying a lot more stuff online. And the future of shopping, as we can all see, is disappearing very fast. However, our high streets are important centers of our neighborhoods and our communities. We need to make sure they are revitalized. We need to be allowing the empty retail units to be used for startup businesses. Local authorities could be purchasing these empty units under their compulsory purchase powers and then renting them out at subsidized rents to people that have good ideas and who will employ people to make them centers of employment. Our educational institutions, I mean, one of the biggest tragedies in the UK is that we've put so much into encouraging more people to go to university at the expense of neglecting technical education. We've destroyed the technical education system in the country, where our former polytechnics and technical colleges, which were excellent, are now third-rate universities. We need to reimagine technical education for the large swathe of the population that are being left behind by the educational system. And those teaching facilities shouldn't be on campuses, they should be in the high street. They should be occupying these units as pop-up educational facilities combined with startup businesses. We can be incorporating our social services provisions and our health provisions in the high streets, not in purpose-built buildings that are inaccessible to most people. Now, if we can get all that activity back into our high street, the few remaining businesses will thrive. They will need coffee bars, they will need some corner shops, and what there is will be solidified and will be strengthened. But we've got to keep the vitality there. The worst thing, of course, is national government. What are they doing? Ripping up the planning rules and saying, oh, shop units can be converted to residential without planning permission. Well, frankly, people don't want to live on a high street behind security grills with the noise of the pub next door. They'd rather be away from the high street, but have the high street as a place they can visit to meet other people and to have the vitality it offers. So I'm afraid we do need something to shape this, and we do need to be encouraging business, but residential, a shop to residential is not the answer, I'm afraid. But the high street has a future. It is our vital neighborhood center.
Thank you, Peter. Dan, a question about the garden bridge.
Yeah, and I'll try to be quite quick with the remaining sort of 3 minutes as well. You know, there's the old adage, isn't there, that the idea of the right tree in the right place. I'd say the wrong bridge in the wrong place, probably. But having said that, I did like the idea for a while because I like the idea of thousands of people spilling over the bridge who, and I found it fascinating that the organisers didn't think about this, capturing some of those people to get them thinking about where nature, technology, finance, health, art, design all converge. And actually, there's nowhere in London to hold all those narratives simultaneously to encourage people to share best practices, ideas, raise finance for those ideas to catalyse more quickly. And I do wonder whether our culture around things like the Garden Bridge, our cynicism over any project like that, ultimately leads to the export of great imaginative ideas to other countries. So many great architects and planners and designers doing fantastic work in the Far East, across Asia, for example, yet not finding the appetite for their designs, their biophilic designs here in London, because it would just be seen as, I don't know, whatever the cynicism is around it. So I guess the only other thing I'll just add very quickly is that where I live in the far west of London, you know, there's no bridge at Barnes if you want to get over from Barnes over to the pub at one particular point. There's not one at Brentford. And actually, I just love there to be a rope bridge. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to cost millions of pounds. Sometimes there's nothing wrong with maybe a good mobility disabled access rope bridge, which may not get so many people across the river, but may cost significantly less than the millions. The last one I'd say on the Garden Bridge as well is just how sad is it that multi-millions of pounds could be raised for that? And yet so many Friends of Parks groups and charities and individuals can't get small pots of money together to buy some seeds or a flower pot, whatever it is. And wouldn't it be great if somehow someone could pull together all the capital of all those individuals who wanted to have their name on the side of a bridge and think about how that same energy could be dispersed across the 33 boroughs and beyond.
Thank you, Dan. I won't have time to ask that last question, but I think, you know, the discussion today has given us so many really, really inspiring ideas. And I think two things that really stuck with me. I think one is this rekindling of the relationship, you know, all sorts of relationship, our relationship with the city, our relationship with each other, how we relate to work and all of that. I think that's one thing that really stuck with me. And the other thing is agency, the power of agency, right? How do we enable the multiple actors to work collaboratively to come up with solutions? And I think that's the spirit of the Design Time of Crisis, which is as a crowdsourcing effort to sort of, you know, create a platform for people to come up with ideas, and then so that we can inspire others. So thank you for joining us. It's been absolutely fascinating. So please do visit an online gallery to see all the submissions to this open call. And then also register for the next event. It's going to be Redesigning Society on April the 27th at 1 p.m. So thank you, Peter, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Oksana, and thank you to all who joined us today.